panelists. We have Brian Dawson, who is an influencer at CloudBees, and then we also have Gary Groover, who is president of Groover Consulting. Thank you both gentlemen for joining me today.
Thank you, Charlene, and good morning. With that, I will go ahead and fill everybody in on what our agenda is for today, and of course to the audience, thank you for joining as well. Today we're going to cover a few topics. We'll first start out with the what and why of DevOps, with defining DevOps. Then we'll review a simple maturity model for quantifying, discussing, and measuring your DevOps transformation with quantified DevOps in the 4 Qs. Then Gary will go through some awesome content related to his book and discuss starting and scaling DevOps, specifically in the enterprise. And then we'll reserve some time for questions and answers. So let me go ahead and introduce myself. I'm the guy on the left. I'm Brian Dawson. I'm a DevOps evangelist, and I like to say practitioner, with CloudBees, the hub of Jenkins and DevOps. I have roughly 25 plus years in various disciplines in the domain of software development. I've actually lost count, but I have had the privilege of across my career of working as a stakeholder in different areas of the software development and delivery process, from development to development management to quality assurance to project management to acting as a system administrator. Sometimes in those capacities in short stints, sometimes for years, but what it did give me is a, what I'd say, unique perspective and a real appreciation on what is critical to DevOps, and that's the involvement and participation of all stakeholders in the development and delivery process. So with that, most recently, I led an enterprise transformation, agile transformation practice, and helped companies small and large implement continuous integration, continuous delivery, and DevOps. And with that, I will hand it over to Gary to first state that we were really lucky to have Gary here presenting. Gary comes from a deep experience of large-scale enterprise DevOps transformations at well-known companies. Gary, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, great to be with CloudBees, and great to be with DevOps.com and get a chance to talk with everybody. Part of my background is I'm an executive who's had good experience leading large-scale transformations, first at HP and then at Macy's.com for the website. Really doing a lot of this stuff before we knew the names that we should be attaching to it, call it DevOps or large-scale Agile or those types of things. And I started writing books and getting more involved in the community just because it had such a transformation on the business as I was running that I felt like I needed to share these experiences with others and help them do. So I've written a few books. I'm now more out consulting, working with companies, doing workshops, and helping as many people as I can realize the benefits that can be associated with transforming how you do software development.
Great. Thank you, Gary. Before you go on mute, let's keep you around for a minute because I want to use that experience to help define DevOps for the audience here. So can you, Gary, go ahead and comment on what your definition of DevOps is?
Yeah, you know, there's so many different people saying it's this, it's that, it's this, it's that, and it gets down into, well, you got to do this practice or that practice, or you're not doing DevOps. And I tend to pull more up at the principles, and I think Gene Kim's done a very good job of capturing the principles. It's all those things that are associated with delivering the proper outcome, and the outcome that we're driving towards is the ability to release code on a more frequent basis while maintaining all aspects of quality, whether it's performance, security, functionality, any of those types of things. So it's really being able to quickly respond to the customer's needs while exceeding all their expectations for quality.
Awesome. Thank you, Gary. And you know, I am in full agreement with that. I think Gene Kim has really helped. Well, people like Gene Kim and yourself, Gary, actually, have really helped sort of stabilize the definition of DevOps, which I'd say, you know, five. And you could even discuss it as far back as 10 years ago. If you ask 10 different people, you'd probably get 9 different answers as to what DevOps is. Based on your description, Gary, like to describe it as a set of cultural principles that you subscribe to and then aspire to, and successfully sort of achieving those principles. There are a number of practices supporting those. So I like to look at the supporting practices as agile, taking an incremental approach to your project planning and execution and development, continuous integration, always integrating to find problems fast, up to continuous delivery, where you've automated your delivery process such that you're always ensuring that your software is deployable or releasable, and then for some, what people call unicorns, but is rapidly becoming the domain of horses, we can extend that with continuous deployment. And really, to repeat something you said, it's about having a supporting process that enables you to deliver software fast, so you could find issues fast and fix them, or identify value fast, eliminate waste, and deliver that value. So let's move on real quick to talk what I referred to up front, talk about what I referred to up front as a simplified model for defining, discussing, and even measuring your DevOps maturity and ultimately driving your DevOps transformation. And this will set the stage for some more strategic approaches and practical approaches to DevOps that Gary will cover. So first I'd like to talk about this thing that I call DevOps word soup, right? If you attend webinars like these, or you've done some reading, or really you've been active in software development, I mean, anytime in the past 5 to 10 years, you've heard these words, from continuous delivery, which we just discussed, to DevSecOps, to rugged DevOps, microservices, Subversion, Git, etc. I'd call this DevOps word soup. In other words, these are all processes, practices, and tools that a lot of the leaders in this space talk about, that a lot of people are leveraging, and they're all very important. But with all the different names for doing things that constitute DevOps and modern software development floating around, oftentimes it's easy to get lost in these to the point that you move into a state of overload. You know, where do I start? What do I do? Well, I'm doing DevOps because I'm doing infrastructure as code, or we're not doing DevOps because we're not using behavior-driven development. So as valuable as these practices are, when you focus too much on the name of the practice and you focus too much on sort of point definitions, that oftentimes either results in the overload and analysis paralysis, or sort of a false sense of success. We are DevOps because we've implemented infrastructure as code. And when that happens, oftentimes you're looking at the complexity, and you're sort of focusing on weaving your way through a level of complexity, instead of identifying what the overall objective is and measuring yourself against that. So as Steve Jobs reportedly once said, simple can be harder than complex. You have to work to get your thinking clean, to make it simple, but once you've done it, it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains, or in sort of the vein of what Gary and I are talking about today, you can scale mountains. So what I recommend is that when we start to talk DevOps within an organization, or we're sort of reviving a stale DevOps initiative, we simplify. And we really boil it down to a few things. Where are we today? Right? What do we do good? What do we need to improve on? We deliver software with features that people love. We do that good. But unfortunately, our quality is low, and our operations guys, our QA guys, and our maintenance teams have to fall on the sword and burn the midnight oil to make sure that we deliver reliable software. We want to fix that. And then you ask, well, where do we want to go? And that's where you lay out objectives such as we want to reduce our defect rate by 50%. We want to reduce our SEV1s by 100%. In other words, we want to never deliver an application to our production server that has a severity 1 defect that interrupts operations. And then ultimately, that's when you guys now as stakeholders in the process can start to figure out how do we get there. And the answer is likely to be some of these DevOps principles, or by adopting a DevOps culture with these supporting principles and practices. Okay, so to introduce you to the quadrants, we'll first introduce you to the axes that contains the SDLC phases: define, plan, code, build, integrate, test, release, deploy, and operate. These are steps that we all perform irrespective of what type of technology we're developing, what we're developing applications for. They may be by a different name, if for instance you're developing for embedded devices instead of web servers. But we all practice these. And we tend to find that we can separate these into what we can call upstream development, where we actually define what we're going to build, we plan it out, we code it, we ensure that we've built something. And then downstream delivery, where we integrate what we've developed into an environment or other code, we test it, we ultimately release it, and then at some point users are going to interact with it. Now, if you're one of the companies, like most companies, as we'll see when we look at the data, that has adopted agile practices, we can call these agile upstream and agile downstream. And really we're talking about mapping the agile concepts to the traditional SDLC. Agile upstream, you can consider, at risk of oversimplification, things like practicing Scrum or iterative development, right, or lean principles in your project planning and execution as well as your development. Upstream, you'll practice things like continuous integration. Downstream is where you've begun to fully automate your testing, your deployment. You're leveraging things like infrastructure as code, or everything as code, with defining your infrastructure, your deployment models, etc. Interesting thing is we find that with recent industry data, that 33% of organizations or more claim to have adopted agile upstream. Usually this is most focused on adopting agile development methodologies for project planning and execution. Yet what's interesting is only 13% of organizations claim to have adopted agile downstream. So immediately we see why we separate these into upstream and downstream. People are practicing agile for upstream development and delivery. They're seeing some value there or some optimization, but then they're hitting an impedance. They're not delivering that value or the benefits of that optimization to their customers or end users via agile downstream methodologies. Now, if we look at our second axis, where we measure level of adoption or level of penetration of these agile methodologies, where they may come at sort of team or one to a few teams. They may be adopted across a work group or a few work groups, or they may be adopted enterprise-wide, where sort of these practices are codified and standardized across an entire organization or in the organization's DNA, as you may say. So let's look at some statistics here. We see our statistic of 33% of organizations that practice agile upstream, but how many people have seen the benefit of agile upstream scaled across their entire organization? What we'll see is that it's only 22% of organizations that claim that they've taken these agile principles and practices and applied them across their organization. We'll take our other stat of agile downstream. Only 13% of the organizations have managed to connect upstream to downstream. And then we look at sort of where, what are our unicorns, where we're adding some horses to the stable today. And these are the companies that have adopted enterprise DevOps. And roughly we can triangulate in on various surveys to say roughly 10% of organizations can claim to have adopted enterprise CD or enterprise DevOps, where they've taken these principles of things like continuous delivery, or these principles with practices like continuous delivery, and have codified those across their organization as the way that they do things. So what does it matter that only 10% of the organizations have made it to that upper right-hand space? Well, data shows, and Gary will talk about with some real examples, the fact that organizations have proved that when they get there, they can innovate faster. Their ability to move faster and deliver faster allows them to respond to market conditions, such as security issues, competitive threats, etc., so that they can gain competitive advantage. Overall, the automation and optimization increases productivity. And something that I find when I go out and I talk with customers and clients, and I have seen in my experience that's not talked about much, is you also tend to increase employee satisfaction, which means you maintain and have a better ability to gain the top talent, which at the end of the day has a cyclical effect on all these other benefits. And DevOps is sort of proven to, at the bottom line, we all function in the business to affect the dollars, right? You can either reduce cost or increase revenue. And a quick stat that I'd like to state before I move on that has been stated by Intuit is when they adopted enterprise continuous delivery, or an enterprise continuous delivery platform, as they rolled it out, they were polling their employees with a standard corporate poll to ask, measure their satisfaction. Within weeks of deploying or onboarding these employees onto a standard continuous delivery platform, they measured a 15% increase in employee satisfaction. Okay? So then, the question kind of comes, that's utopia, huh? That's great. Enterprise DevOps, upper right-hand space, innovate faster. Look, how do we get there? Or why isn't everybody there? Well, it's not easy. I won't tell you the truth. Obviously, I'm trying to simplify it here. I mean, I will tell you the truth. I won't tell you that it's easy. It can be done, but it's difficult. You have to connect across upstream and downstream to establish continuity across the three planes of what I call the DevOps Trinity: people, process, and tools, culture, practices, and technology. And really, when we look at sort of traditional software development or traditional organizations, really, there tend to be chasms between the groups or sometimes the silos that represent these stages of delivery and boil down to upstream and downstream. So upstream tends to focus on move fast and innovate. They're measured on what can we implement, how fast can we implement new features, how fast can we innovate. They tend to adopt processes and practices that lend themselves to moving fast, and the way that tools and technologies are chosen and adopted and they change are very different and very rapid. Whereas if we look at our downstream delivery with QA and operations, there's a focus on maintaining quality, stability, uptime. We use practices that we think or feel help ensure there will be no errors when we deliver, which in reality, there's always going to be errors. You need to embrace that and fix them. And we have a tools and technology procurement process that is focused again on stability. And these are sort of chasms that we have to cross and connect. So to set the framework sort of for identifying what part of those chasms that we're stuck on in terms of upstream and downstream and growth, we observe sort of the division of this problem space of enterprise DevOps, and we apply quadrants with names to them that allow us to sort of identify where we are and discuss with others in an abstract way where we are. So if we look at quadrant 1, that's a company that's practicing what we call team-level agile. We look at quadrant 2, that's a company that's practicing what we call team-level CD. So a quadrant 2 company, for instance, has one to a few teams, but not all of their teams, that have managed to connect development to delivery to cross the chasms that we've discussed and achieve a certain level of automated, continuous delivery with collaboration between development and operations, or the business development, QA, and operations. Then we go to the upper left-hand side and we discuss a quadrant 3 company, which is an enterprise agile company. These companies have tended to scale their agile practices all the way across the organization, but they haven't connected them downstream. So they could move, execute their definition to integration phase in days, weeks, days, or even hours. But they haven't connected that to downstream to become what we call a quadrant 4 company, where they're practicing enterprise DevOps. They take an agile or iterative approach all the way from concept to customer, and these practices are a core part of their organization. So we'll just quickly review these quadrants so you guys can sort of map them to where you feel that your teams and organizations are. And then Gary will talk a bit more about how to sort of cross these quadrants. So to revisit a quadrant 1 or Q1 company, these companies tend to have things like Scrum implemented, so they're practicing some iterative development. They may have mature CI across many, continuous integration across many of their teams. They may leverage some tools federalization and standardization, like maybe Jira is used across all of their teams, but development is still disconnected from delivery, and oftentimes these are water, scrum, fall companies. These are where you will see most companies at. A quadrant 2 company, as I said, practice team level CD. So some teams are very mature in their continuous delivery implementation. Most importantly, their development is connected to delivery from not only a tools and technology standpoint, but a process and practice standpoint. And you can identify these guys as having some teams that can release software on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, or sometimes even on an hourly basis or per change with confidence. An enterprise agile company is where you see a lot of companies, where I think the second most highest number of organizations are, with the adoption over the last 10, 15, 20 years of things like extreme programming and Scrum. Many companies have adopted enterprise agile. They may have standardized on continuous integration as a service with solutions like Jenkins. They have tools centralization and standardization, and they're recognizing increased developer productivity, but they haven't yet seen the value or the benefit of being able to get software to customers in days, for instance. So a quadrant 4 company has mature CD on most to all teams. They tend to be able to treat their continuous delivery platform as a service, so they can deliver it on demand to teams. They've standardized on development delivery tools. They've adopted a culture of experimentation, collaboration, and learning. And what you find now is most teams in the organization can release in cycles that are measured in weeks, days, or even hours. Okay, so to revisit real quick the trinities and the chasms, what really is important as we look at those quadrants is we're then breaking down and we're saying, well, what are we doing to ensure that we are connecting people, process, tools, and technologies left to right, but not only that, we're connecting them left to right, and then we're doing it in a way that they're ultimately scalable. So we can involve not just a portion of the organization, but all of the organization. So at this point, I'd like to hand it to Gary, where he has some wonderful experience and some specific and some wonderful guidance on really things that you will do to cross these chasms and implement this trinity. So Gary, with that, I'm going to go ahead and get ready to hand you presenter rights.
Thanks, Brian. It's great to be here. If you could improve the productivity of your software development processes by 2 to 3x, would it matter? What if you could start saying yes to all those business requests you'd created elaborate processes for saying no to? Would that make a difference? What if you decided all this was too hard, all this was too complex, but your competitors went all in and transformed how they did software development and got that 2 to 3x improvement in productivity? Can you see how that'd make an impact on your company, on your coworkers, and eventually yourselves? I start every presentation I give on transforming software development processes with those 3 questions because I think it truly represents the opportunities associated with embracing these new ways of working and the risk associated with ignoring trends in the industry. And as I spent the last several years going around the world talking to people about the types of results and promoting my books and really talking about the experience that we had at HP, I really feel like we were able to deliver easily 2 to 3x improvements in productivity. When we started out, firmware was a bottleneck for the business. We couldn't add a product, we couldn't add a feature without checking. The answer was no. The organization spent forever trying to spin its way out of the problem. 2008 hit, we had to cut costs, and through re-engineering how we did our software development and delivery, we were able to drop our costs almost in half. At the same time, we were able to support 140% more products, and we increased the capacity for innovation from 5% of what we were doing to 40%. Fundamentally transform the business by delivering that 2 to 3x improvement in productivity. And this was a journey that we went on, and we transformed it. And what was interesting as we looked back, what we realized is we'd applied a lot of the agile principles, but we'd left the individual teams with a lot of flexibility over how they worked. And what we realized at the end of this transformation was when we looked across the team, some of them had done a really good job of agile, and some of them were working in more traditional manners. And we didn't see dramatic differences in the productivities across the teams, but we did see dramatic differences in the overall system. And it led us to the conclusion that in a large organization with a tightly coupled system where a lot of people have to work together, the first order effect is how the teams come together to deliver value. The second order effect is how the individual teams work. And a lot of that, how the teams come together to deliver value, is coordinating the work, is a lot of the early DevOps principles that we started doing before it was really called DevOps, and that was making sure everybody's integrating their code on an ongoing basis, that we're testing it frequently, that we're going to smaller batch sizes, that we're going to more releasable code. A lot of those things that you would do to maintain quality and release on a more frequent basis. And we realized that those things are a lot about coordinating the work across teams and focusing on doing that. And those, I feel, are much more important in large organizations. Not that large organizations with tightly coupled systems will ever deliver more frequently, but it's just that the inefficiencies in large organizations coordinating large software projects are just so much more pronounced. The productivities are going to be more important. And the good news is I go out and talk to more and more people in the industry about this. More and more people are excited about doing DevOps. The only challenge I'm seeing with it as I get into the details and start working with these organizations is they all have a little different definition of what DevOps is. And it's like 5 blind men describing an elephant. I go off and I talk to developers, and they're way excited about doing DevOps. And they go, really? So you're going to make sure that you have automated tests and that the automated tests are passing with every check-in. You're going to make sure that any changes that you make to the infrastructure, your environments, is going to be done through code. You're going to coordinate that with operations people and all the teams in between to make sure that those changes work in all the different stages of your deployment pipeline and work through that process. And do that. The developer goes, well, no, I'm not going to do that. That sounds like a lot of work. I just want to be able to release my code a lot easier. I heard at Netflix the first day on the job you get to push code into production, and I just want to push code in production. You have no idea how hard and difficult that is in my organization. You got to change resistance board. I got to get on these really long release cycles. I got to go to a launch call. It's the most painful, god-awful thing in the world. No, I just want to push into production and figure out how to make this work. I can't be going through all that difficult stuff. And I go and talk to the release team, and it's like, you want to do DevOps? Like, yeah, we're way excited. Really? So you're going to make sure that you automate your release processes and make them efficient to the point where you can release code daily, multiple times a day, very small iterations where it's easy to localize and understand the problem? Well, no, wait, I can't do that. If I was going to release every day, I'd have to have my change resistance board meeting every day. No, I couldn't do that. That's a long, painful meeting. No, right now I'm the babysitter in the organization. I got to go figure out who changed what, where they changed. I got to get the right code. I got to get the right environment. I got to get it configured correctly. People are changing stuff all the time and not telling me. They don't tell anybody. What I really need is I need all that stuff in version control, the definition of the environment. I need it all automated so I'm consistently doing it across all the different environments. And I need to make sure that the tests are automated so I can quickly validate the effect of a change so I can go to smaller batch sizes and quicker feedback. No, that's why I want to do DevOps. And I go talk to operations people, and they're excited about doing DevOps too. They go, really? So you're going to make sure that you never log on and manually make a change to a server, and you're going to make sure that that's all done with scripts, and when you make a change to a definition of a server, you're going to make sure that starts at the front end of the deployment pipeline up like development so it flows through the system just like code is, and you're not ever going to manually batch or process anything in production. Well, no, wait. I can't do that. I'm in operations. I'm constantly firefighting. I am so busy I couldn't find time for that. I have manually set up each one of these servers. Typically, I give them a name so they remember exactly what things are going on with that one. They're all a little different. If it wasn't for me being able to firefight in production and actually know what's going on, this place would never run. No, I'm way too important to be spending time with all those other people. No, I want to do DevOps so I can have feature toggles because I want to be able to, on a Friday night when I get a call at 2 o'clock in the morning about some new feature that a developer had to get into production that broke everything, I can wake up, I can turn the feature toggle off, I can go back to bed, and he can deal with it on Monday morning instead of ruining my weekend like he does now. So the good news is everybody's excited about doing DevOps, but they have a slightly different definition of what DevOps is, what it means, and how to implement it. What could possibly go wrong other than creating a DevOps elephant that doesn't really look like an elephant? It has all the right parts, it has all the right pieces, it just doesn't look like an elephant, it doesn't work like an elephant, it doesn't deliver the business results that you're expecting, and in fact it's more of a face plant where you lose all the momentum and credibility for what you're really hoping to achieve with DevOps. One of the biggest challenges I see as I go out and I start working with organizations is trying to get them all on the same page and aligned on where they're going to go and what they're going to accomplish. I like to start with Gene's definition. We talked about that earlier. It's a good place to start. It's a good definition. It's as good as anything. And as I look at this, I think everybody out there would already be doing this if it wasn't so hard and difficult. But the challenge is there's a lot of inefficiencies and waste in your system that impacts your ability to do this on a regular basis. And when you think about the waste and inefficiency, I think the best framework for analyzing and figuring that out is a deployment pipeline that was put out there by Jez Humble and David Farley in their continuous delivery book. And what is a deployment pipeline? It is nothing more than starting with a business idea, handing that business idea off to the developer, having an environment for the developer to do the testing in, moving that code over to the environment for testing, after the testing having some sort of decision criteria for making sure it's ready to go into production, moving that code base into production on an ongoing basis, and then monitoring it to make sure that it's working correctly. Fairly straightforward, easy process. How hard could it possibly be? I mean, I don't even know why we're having this webinar. It seems so pretty straightforward and simple. And this is the idea for one developer. And as you start doing this in larger organizations, this starts to become more complex and it's harder, and there's different inefficiencies that are out there in the system. And there's different DevOps practices that have been identified to start to address these. And it's hard to understand the complexity of a very large enterprise environment. So we're going to start with one developer and look at the types of things that go wrong and the types of things that people do to address those inefficiencies. So starting with the business idea, frequently more organizations start by building up way too much inventory in terms of planning and requirements in front of the developer. And if lean manufacturing has taught us anything, it's that when there's excess inventory in the system, it tends to lead to a lot of waste in terms of rework and expediting. Rework in terms of the developer doesn't understand what's really being requested. It needs to go back for redefinition, rework associated with the market changing, the market shifting, so we need to redefine this requirement, or expediting because the priorities of the market have changed and requirements that you spend a lot of time investing, creating, analyzing, planning, doing all those sorts of things are either delivered and don't deliver the value expected, or reprioritized lower and never worked on because something more urgent came through the system. There's a lot of movements to more just-in-time planning that help to address that. They're covered in more detail in the book, which you'll all get a copy of. So we'll move on to the next one. You move it into the developer. And then the next thing the developer, once they have the code written, is going to need an environment for testing. And for some organizations, just getting those environments is the biggest lead time and the biggest opportunity for DevOps. I know of one large organization that started their DevOps journey just by trying to figure out how long would it take to get Hello World up and going in their environment. And after 9 months, I think it was, they got to the point where they still didn't have Hello World up and going, but they tracked this ticket all the way through the system and understood the barriers and the constraints in the system. And then they ran it on Amazon Web Services and got Hello World up and going in 2 hours. So it characterized the opportunity, it characterized the inefficiencies, and they were able to use that to go after the biggest bottleneck in their system for releasing on a more frequent basis. Next, you move the code over into this environment for testing, and you want to make sure that it's good and is ready to go. A lot of organizations start their DevOps journey with manual testing or automated testing that they run at the end of a cycle. And I would say, other than having consistent, stable environments, moving to stable, maintainable, triageable, automated testing that's gating code is probably one of the most important things that you can be doing to transform your software development processes. And a lot of people struggle with this step. They create tests that aren't maintainable. They're doing automated testing afterwards. And I would say you're not doing automated testing until you're using it to gate code. And if you're gating code with it and it's not stable, it's not reliable, your developers are going to give you that feedback immediately. So one of the first places I start after environments is just making sure that that's ready to go and stable and you can use it for gating code. Next, you need to make a decision to move it over, or approval priorities, and then you move it into production. And a lot of large organizations are still using different tools and processes and testing and approaches when they go into production than they use in that testing environment. You need to make sure you're using the same tools, the same processes, so that you're repeating the process and automating on an ongoing basis in the environment testing phase, and then that's a boring phase into it. And right now, a lot of large organizations do very large release calls with different tools and different processes and are finding new stuff each time. And then finally, you monitor it, and you can find problems out there that you weren't expecting. And organizations have found the balance with DevOps between testing and validating everything and testing in production. But if you're going to test in production, you don't test with a lot of stuff. You give a very small canary. And this isn't an excuse not to do the testing upstream. It's just a realization that you're never going to find everything and you can't afford to. So it's a balance of that thing, and they go to dark releases and canary releases and those different types of things. So there's different things across the system that you can do. And when you look at this, I've just described a simpler one developer environment and a bunch of things that you could go after. The challenge is, how do you figure out where to go after? Because what you want to do is make sure that you're creating positive momentum off your transformation and getting it going and getting it going off the ground. And what I do is I tend to map this out, and I start collecting metrics on it, and I look at types of things. For the business ideas, there's some specific metrics that I use to identify the inefficiencies there. For the environments, there's some metrics. For the testing cycle, there's some metrics. For the release, for the monitoring. And then you look at all these metrics across the system, and you get everybody together, you map it out, you introduce everybody to the principles, and then they start to get a common view of the elephant, and they look at where the biggest inefficiencies are, because you can't do all this at once, and you want to start with the things that are going to help the organization the most, and the best way that you get there is by mapping this out. And this is for one developer in a deployment pipeline. It's a pretty simple process, but you can start to see the value of having a map that gets everybody on the same page. The challenge is most of the large organizations I work with have more than one developer. And when you start to scale up beyond that, you really need to understand whether you're trying to scale your DevOps principles and practices to small teams that can independently develop, qualify, and deploy code, or are you into scaling into large, tightly coupled systems. I've got a little bit in the book, and we'll cover just briefly the sort of small independent teams because I think there's a lot already out there in the industry. But I'll spend more of my time with the large, tightly coupled systems because I think coordinating the work across 5 people and 500 people requires a different approach and a different process, and there's not a lot talked about for the large, tightly coupled systems, so I'm going to spend the majority of my time focused in on that area. And the first step I do is let's segment off the stuff that doesn't matter, isn't critical to the business, isn't worth the investment, set that aside, take the loosely coupled, identify those. That's more going to be about empowering the teams and making sure they have the resources, and then identify the tightly coupled system because I think those are where your biggest challenges are going to be and where the biggest inefficiencies are going to be. Not that you'll ever release these more frequently, but just because the inefficiencies are so high, the benefits for improving the development, qualification, and release of those systems are going to be the ones that are most pronounced. Ideally, if you take this tightly coupled system, what you would want to do is you'd want to do continuous integration and testing of all these teams and all these people on an ongoing basis. The challenge is these large enterprise systems tend to take longer to build, longer to test, longer to put together, and so you end up with, and they have lots more developers, so you end up with so many people in a continuous integration build that you can't effectively triage the source of the problem, you can't keep it green very well, and it gets just too large and too complex. What I recommend in those cases when you get a build, when your build cycle is including more than about 20 developers, you really need to start breaking this down and simplifying these into stable subsystems. Look for places in your architecture where there's natural organizational boundaries or clean architectural interfaces, and look to use service virtualization to mock the other part of this, and you use that to break that down into stable subsystems. And you have those subsystems, and then what you do is you create a deployment pipeline and design it to build those stable subsystems up into a stable enterprise environment. And you do this but with quality gates and continuous integration and continuous integration and continuous integration and building up the subsystems. You would start with each component, and that would build, and you do continuous integration of that, and you'd have a quality gate. If component A passed its continuous integration and testing, then that version of the code would be promoted into the subsystem. You do that the same for each piece. This has a couple of advantages. Earlier we talked about improving the frequency and quality of feedback to developers and localizing the triage. If we have a good quality gate in front of component A, we've got a small group of people that's getting feedback very rapidly, very quickly. And the other thing it does is it keeps this subsystem more stable. So it's rapid feedback, stable enterprise systems. And then as you go past this, you build this up, and then you have another quality gate for releasing this subsystem. Eventually, you have each of your subsystems that you're building up into a qualified enterprise system. They each have to pass a quality gate. They have to work through it. And when you look at your large, tightly coupled system, you're going to want to break it up into subsystems. You want to figure out the quality gates that it has to go through to build those up and release it and move it on to the next stage and eventually work through this. This is what I mean by designing an enterprise deployment pipeline that you use to go from a business idea all the way out into production. We talked a little bit about the metrics earlier, and we'll get into a little more detail, but I tend to look at cycle time for these things that helps you identify where to go after the biggest issues. I tend to look at the source of the issues. If you've got a lot of environment issues and you're expecting your developers to respond to continuous integration, it's not going to work. They're going to get frustrated. They're going to check out. So a lot of what I do after I put the get people to design the deployment pipeline or define what they're currently using. We start to collect metrics on it. And these types of metrics tell you whether you need to be going after infrastructure as code, you need to be really looking at your test framework and redesigning that towards more stable and more reliable. And you can work through that process. There's more detail in the book that you'll get an example of, but this is really the process for designing a large, complex system where a lot of people have to work together, and then getting people to agree on what are the biggest issues that we need to go after first and working down that process. And if you go through this and systematically analyze it, I think you've got an opportunity to deliver the types of business results that we talked about earlier, and you have a elephant that looks like an elephant, works like an elephant, and actually performs better than you could ever expect, and maybe even starts to look a little bit like a unicorn. I spend a lot of time and energy trying to help other people realize the benefits of this because of what I've been seeing it be able to do for business. The book's out there as a resource. I tend to do webinars and educations. I do workshops and different things. Hopefully I've provided you enough framework to get going on your journey. And with that, Charlene, maybe we could open it up to questions and see what else we could be doing to help people along with their journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Gary. We have gotten some really great questions in so far, so let's go ahead and dive right on in. We have a question from Ricardo who's asking, so what about the people? Are there approaches to shift to DevOps culture in a company that doesn't maybe necessarily see the value of continuous delivery?
We had a couple more that were kind of like that too. Were there other ones that kind of fit into this culture, organizational change management piece?
Well, we do have one that the question is, how do you all departments in a company involved in the DevOps culture, top level management, mostly do not know what it is? How do you introduce it to them? It's a process that needs to start at the top level, would you say? The tech guys get it, so is there an approach that you can use to kind of get to those guys?
Right. So I think both of those kind of make it stand out that a lot of this is about organizational change management, getting people on board, getting them excited about it, getting them engaged. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. As an executive, I've seen the benefits, but what I realized out there leading transformations is that there weren't a lot of resources out there for me. So what I tried to do with leading the transformation is really put out what I think the executive's role is and why to get them excited and how to get them going. And then as I started working with more organizations, I found that I was spending time analyzing where to start and how to get going. And that's why I put out the Starting and Scaling DevOps. So both of those books are quick, easy reads. They're like 100 pages because I know executives can't read more than that or won't read more than that. So I try to get that out there for something quick and easy to read that's a resource. So, I mean, you can say it sometimes passing out books and getting people the common terminology and approach is important, but yeah, I think there'll be some grassroots efforts that'll work and have been successful, but eventually you get frustrated influencing across or up in the organization. And if you get 9 out of the 10 teams willing to keep their code base stable and release it more frequently, but the one doesn't, you're not going to get any better. So eventually, if you've got a large tightly coupled system, you need to engage the executives and get them excited and have them help lead and drive it. And to do that, I usually start with what are their business objectives. I wouldn't do DevOps, I wouldn't do Agile, I wouldn't do Lean or Kanban. What about your current software development and delivery process isn't meeting the needs of your business, and what should you change to make it work? And I tend to start that way to get people engaged. What I tried to put out there with the resources was just some quick education that people could be on the same page. I do workshops, whatever it takes, but I would try to spend the time to get people to embrace the idea and understand how it can make their business better, because you can really get the 2 to 3x improvement in productivity. What more important thing is there out there that the executives should be working on?
Yeah. If you guys don't mind, Charlene, I'll go ahead and first big +1 on what Gary said. It aligns perfectly with mine.
Go right ahead.
aligns perfectly with my experience. I tend to find that the grassroots buy-in and the grassroots effort is important. But as you try to extend across your organizational and technological silos that go from left to right, and then more importantly, as you try to propagate these practices across the organization, that can't be done from the single point of a few grassroots teams or work group. It needs management support. Now, conversely, if you try to come in strictly top-down with a mandate or an edict and don't take time to get people working together, that also presents problems. And in terms, of a couple of disparate points around starting, I do think it's really important. One, that you get executive support, but you don't try a big bang initiative, right? You sort of adopt a bit of to misstate it, the agile principles that we don't know what we don't know, and we need to embrace that. So you learn iteratively about what works to meet your business objectives, and there's going to be some pain along the way. And then the last point that I would like to make in terms of that is that it's important to get all of your stakeholders together up front as you identify the business goals or the pains that or the gains you're trying to achieve, and have everybody have a voice on how you're going to get there. So then everybody feels ownership in the process, and everybody is participant in working through troubled times and helping achieve the better state.
Okay, great. So we have a related question, and it's quite possible that the answer is the same, but I want to go ahead and throw it out to you guys, and feel free to make your comments. The question is, we're struggling to bring different teams in the enterprise to work on a common goal. Every team is working on automation, which solves their problems, but pipeline is not flowing. How do we convince people without impacting the organization and team structures?
That's where I really try to get the executives responsible for a deployment pipeline, and make the deployment pipeline as small as you can. If it's not tightly coupled and doesn't have to work together, it should be something else. Mm-hmm. But try to make it as small as you possibly can, get the leaders of that to come together, map it out, get that common view, put some metrics on it, and get everybody across the deployment pipeline to agree on what are the things that they think they should be fixing over the next 30 days to make the biggest difference.
Yep, I agree. I think our earlier answers answered it. And Gary, okay. I need to keep just +1 in you, but obviously he's done it, and it's metrics. Look, if the pipeline's not flowing, it's not going to be enough for people just to say, hey, things aren't flowing, things are broken. You have to, as you start on the transformation, identify how you measure your success, make those very conspicuous, and just point to the real data. Look, the pipeline's not flowing, let's diagnose and fix it.
Okay, great. So we have time, I think, for 1 or 2 more questions. Here's a question. We are having a tough time moving past CI, continuous integration. Any thoughts on how to get buy-in from downstream?
It's funny, and I'll lead in on this, Gary, and then I'll hand it to you. I'll lead in because this is very much what I see, and I was referring to when I talk about the quadrants, right? Most organizations I talk to are stuck in exactly that position. They've seen modernization upstream in the development process that started with the adoption of Agile, that started within doing continuous non-functional testing and integration with continuous integration. But then to connect to downstream, they find that that's a very different world than QA is geared up for. Right? They're used to using big bang regression testing, then operations is prepared for. They're not prepared to rapidly accept deliveries into their prod or even pre-prod environment. I think it very much goes back to the other things that we've said. It is about buy-in. It's about figuring out what about the process of continuing integration that you want to extend downstream is going to benefit these other teams, sort of speaking to their need, benefit the teams as well as the organization. Getting them to buy into the fact that they want to see those benefits, and then working together to define practically what are going to be the items that, with the highest return that you can take to meet those benefits. Now, there's a reality, like especially when we talk, say, QA, that it may very well be that the skill set isn't there, right? So it may involve some training from outside organizations. It may involve picking up a few new members of staff, or it may involve just understanding that we're going to come in, collaborate, and we're going to work through this and learn together. But my number one thing that I would say goes back to that aligned on shared objectives thing. Understand that you don't tell them, hey, CI is great, we loved it, I want to extend it so we can push more stuff to you. Or rather, you frame in a way that helps them in the business.
All right, great. Well, I think that is pretty much all the time we have for today's webinar, but I do want to thank Brian Dawson and Gary Groover for giving such a great presentation. I'm sure the audience got a lot out of it. Again, today's webinar will be posted to the DevOps.com website 24 hours after the event. Also, we'll be receiving a follow-up email with a link to the webinar. So if you want to listen to it again, you have the ability to do so. But again, check the DevOps.com website for future webinars, and I do want to one more time thank Brian Dawson and Gary Groover for joining me today. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Best of luck, everybody, on your journey.
All right, thank you, everybody. Best of luck. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.